Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will be discussing the Morgan Affair.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have three-quarters of our usual hosts with Brother Craig Graham from Kalamalka Lodge number 160 in British Columbia, David Colbeth from King Solomon Lodge number 60 in Washington, and I'm Matt Appel. I'm a member of Mill Creek number 243, also here in Washington. And we have, Stephen couldn't be with us this evening. He's off camping or doing something outside of the range of the internet, so we're without him this evening. But we have a special guest, very worshipful brother Jeremy Yielding, who's a member of Stilicon number 2, just down by Tacoma there, and who does a presentation on the Morgan Affair that we figured makes him as close to an expert as we're going to meet on the subject, although I'm pretty sure he would deny being an expert. So when we were discussing in our path through the Freemasons for Dummies book, way back in chapter 2, there was a brief couple of pages on the Morgan Affair, and we said at the time, "Oh yeah, we'll talk about that later and have a guest on." And here we are, a couple months later, and finally got nabbed Jeremy and got him to agree to be on the show. So I guess first of all, Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate being invited.
And so given that, as we talked about in the Blue Room, we don't really want to do a recap necessarily of your presentation, could you please recap your presentation and let us know what the the broad strokes of the Morgan Affair were?
So in very broad strokes, I think the Morgan Affair is all about trying to determine who William Morgan really was and what retrospective character assassination or building up you want to do, depending on who you ask. And he is portrayed as either an absolute saint or a terrible sinner. Again, depending on who you ask, I think. But it teaches us several good Masonic lessons about guarding the West Gate, about even if you have guarded the West Gate, about being true to the four cardinal virtues of temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude, really not forgetting your own obligations and ensuring that you're using both your cognitive brain and your sense of truth to the obligations that we all gave in deciding how you reprehend with justice in certain matters. So it's an interesting soap opera-ish story where you have someone who may or may not have been a Mason, who committed to publishing the secrets of Freemasonry and was abducted screaming from the jail at Canandaigua by men who were known to be Masons and subsequently never seen again. So what happened to him, we're not sure, but it's an interesting story, and there are several different factors and different parts that have had some influence, including the climate of upstate New York at the time, the rapid growth of Masonry in New York, in the upstate region, as well as downstate as well in the city, and how nature abhors a vacuum. And how people that were in power, that there were others that wanted to be in power. So Masonry gets used as a means to an end for the anti-Masonic movement, which gins up, and it has national implications for politics and the formation of our country at that time. So it's an interesting story.
So as far as the facts that I know about it, that I can shut up and look like I've said something important. So it was 1826, so not quite 200 years ago now. There was a man, Captain. I've heard him called Captain Morgan, and it always makes me think of the ring. But he was a captain. He fought in the War of 1812, and in upstate New York, who, as Jeremy just said, may or may not have been a Mason, and was intending to publish some of our secrets in yet another expose in upstate New York, and bad things ensued. Probably.
Perhaps we really don't know. And I think just given the tone and tenor of everything that occurred, there were several stopping points at which things could have been avoided. There were cooler heads that tried to prevail. There were attempts at arson at the printing shop. There were standoffs between rioters that wanted to go in and break down the printing presses. There were abductions of the printer himself, where he was extrajudiciously rendered to a neighboring town, where they actually took him into a lodge and tried to well, we're not really sure what they were trying to do, other than they shouldn't have done what they did. And there were subsequent criminal trials in Canandaigua for years to come, and several Masons' lives were ruined, and the anti-Masonic movement really took off. So anyway, yeah, lots of good stuff and not so good stuff. Lots of interesting stuff.
Before we get too far, I'll make a note that I'll put a link in the show notes to a presentation that Jeremy did for one of our districts during COVID. As a matter of fact, I think it was. And so you'll have the kind of the whole story, or has his whole story of that. But there's lots of cool videos and information out there on various YouTube lands. And so anyway, I just wanted to make that point that we'll do that. So if you want to get the whole story, we can pause here and go watch that presentation and come back.
Jeremy, I was going to mention, I'm like Matt, every time I hear Captain Morgan, I get the sort of the Sailor Jerry impression of somebody. What do we know about him that is more or less true? As murky as it is after 100 and some odd years.
Well, we know that he was born in Virginia, in Culpeper, Virginia, in about 1774, and that he actually worked as an operative stonemason. Then later he ends up working as a brick mason. We think that he was a veteran of the War of 1812. And in some stories that it's even alleged that he sailed with the infamous pirate John Lafitte. And thus he's sometimes given that honorific of captain. There are also several other William Morgans that were listed in the rolls of the Virginia militia, but none of those actually have been found to be associated with the rank of captain. We know that he married a Methodist daughter, Miss Lucinda Pendleton, in Richmond, Virginia, in 1819. She was all of, I think, 16 years of age, and he was in his 40s at that time. And we also know that he lived and worked for a time in Little York, Ontario, which eventually then becomes Toronto, where he works as a brewer for a little while. But then he went bankrupt and his brewery burned. And so he migrates down to Rochester and starts working as a brick mason. And it's alleged that he received his degrees in Canada, although it has not been possible to ever verify that. But he eventually had someone, and some say that it was his employer in Rochester, who gave lawful information, got him into the lodge there in Batavia. And once he was in, he then started to learn the work. And in fact, it was alleged that Blanchard Powers, the Grand Lecturer, was in the area at the time trying to raise the standard of the work. Because again, this is frontier masonry at this time. This is the Wild West. A lot of these towns have only been around for 20 or 30 years at that point. Rochester started in like 1802 with 15 people, and 20 years later, it's got like 2,500 people. So Batavia had just been founded just a few decades before. So when Morgan comes in, he gets with Blanchard Powers, and according to some authors, I'm sure that, and this seems logical to me, that if you're the Grand Lecturer and you're trying to raise the standard of masonry throughout, if you have somebody who's been said, yeah, he's a mason, you have lawful information on him, then he's going to learn it. And Morgan becomes a ritual powerhouse. So he's got a great singing voice. He does table lodges really well, and he learns the middle chamber lecture. And he's so well respected for his lecture abilities that people pay for his lodging to come in and give a lecture, or to sing at a festive board. But every time that he goes to one of these lodges, because he's traveling as a bricklayer throughout the several communities in upstate New York, and every time he goes out to a lodge and does some ritual piece, inevitably something goes missing. He borrows a shirt or a cravat or a handkerchief or whatever. And so he doesn't get invited back to a lot of these places. So, kind of outstays his welcome. But he ends up kind of wearing out his welcome in a lot of places. We do know that he was initiated into a chapter of Royal Archmasons in Leroy, New York, and I think it's
Western Star.
Western Star 35.
Yep.
So
32 is what I had, but yeah.
He gets into that that Royal Arch chapter, and then later on, and this is something that because he had a propensity for getting into debt and also for drinking an awful lot, and so they tried to start a chapter of Royal Archmasons in Batavia itself, and he signs the original charter. He's going to be a charter member of this new chapter of Royal Archmasons. He then goes on a bender, has sort of a blackout period, and while he's blacked out, they realize, hey, he signed this thing, and we don't want him in the chapter, and so they tear up that charter, and they repaper it without him being a member. And then when he comes out of it, he realizes that he's not a member, and they don't even let him sit in the chapter with them. So he then gets this great idea, along with the publisher of the Batavian Advocate, sometimes they're called the Republican Advocate, which is one of these 4-sheet newspapers. So this guy, Davids, I believe his name, John Davids is the publisher. And so he's got his publishing house. He and Morgan's landlord, Morgan's landlord is David. Sorry about that. David Miller is the publisher. And so Miller and Davids and an investor from Rochester, Mr. Russell
Dyer. Yeah.
All kind of get together and say, hey, we're going to write this expose. It will make you a 1/4 inheritor of the profits of this. We'll all be partners in this great expose, because you now know the work and you could transcribe it all out. And so they all meet in March of that year, and they say, okay, we're going to sign the pledge of secrecy. We're going to get this done, and we're all going to be rich. And they are able to keep it under their hats for a couple months until Morgan again goes on a tear and goes to Danold's tavern. And David Danold is a master mason and proprietor of the tavern. And Morgan is in there pontificating about how he's going to publish all the secrets of masonry to everybody that wants to buy them for the fee of $1. And so that secret rapidly gets out. So, and then things start to kind of cascade from there.
Now, if I can just bring something up here quickly,
Please.
This writing this expose, this was kind of a thing at that time, wasn't it? This was by no means the first of them, and there were quite a number of them, and it was seen as it appears to me in some of the stuff that I've read that it can be seen as a bit of there's a possibility for a lucrative enterprise here if you do this right. So these guys are perhaps a little trying to rub some pennies together and realize that they can make a quick buck doing this, right? There's definitely a side hustle and a huckster side to this, isn't there?
100%. And they thought they were going to be really, really wealthy after doing this. In fact, after some subsequent developments, they end up swearing out, where Morgan calls out his partners pretty strongly in a letter that we have from him. They end up signing a penal bond for $250,000 to say that the publication will happen and that no one can back out. In fact, Morgan threatens them with physical violence and wants to confront them. But they sign that penal bond and away they go. So yeah,
It's kind of like Pigpen from it just miscreants and mystery and malfeasance seem to follow him wherever he goes.
Well, he's one of these people where when he was sober, he was allegedly a very uh very, I don't know, an affable gentleman who people got along with well, but when he was not sober, he was often violent, and there was allegations that when you tried to give when they tried to give charity to his wife Lucinda and his family who weren't staying with him. So Lucy and the boys, um, they were staying with another family by the name of Stewart, while Morgan stayed with one of his conspirators, Mr. Davids. And so they weren't living together, but you couldn't give charity to Morgan because he'd just go to the tavern and spend it. Instead, he had to give it straight to Lucinda in order for it to do any good for the family. And he would take her by the hair and thrash her about and break down the furniture and all this stuff. He was not probably he was an abusive drunk, is what it sounds like from the accounts. Depends on which accounts, though, right? So as after he disappears and they try and sort of retroactively resurrect his character, he becomes a gentle family man who, although he did like a drink, he is rehabilitated in the eyes of the anti-Masons.
Mhm.
As if by magic.
As if by magic, absolutely. And there are great articles published in some of these 4-sheet publications, which you can go onto the internet, and this is a great thing, right? So when I came up with the presentation, I was challenged to do it in like 30 days because I was trying to get it in for education for a meeting at Stilichen. And we're able to actually go out there and pull up these 4-sheet digitized newspapers, and you can see the editorials, and you can see the letters to the editor. And the Masons put out a neat, let's see here, notice and caution. This was done on August the 9th. This is after Morgan's partner David Miller began advertising the expose through his newspaper, saying that Morgan had written out a full and complete illustration of all the esoteric work and the lectures and all the secret stuff. And he promises that it will in a short time be issued from his press for the mere price of $1. And so then on August 9th, a notice appears in the Canandaigua, Ontario Messenger to warn the population about what a scumbag Morgan was. And they allege that he was a swindler. It says, notice and caution, if any man calling himself William Morgan should intrude himself on the community, they should be on their guard, particularly the Masonic fraternity in all capital letters. Morgan was in this village May last, and his conduct, while here and elsewhere, calls forth this notice. Any information in relation to Morgan can be obtained by calling at the Masonic Hall in this village. W. Morgan is considered a swindler and a dangerous man. There are people in this village who would be happy to see this Captain Morgan. Signed, Canandaigua, August 9th, 1826. So they put him on notice, and the tensions were really sort of ratcheting up as he was going into the tavern and telling people, yeah, I'm halfway through that 3rd degree, and I'm almost to completion. It'll be published in a few short months. And he's teaching the people in the tavern all of the modes of recognition that we have, and giving them the lectures and the obligations and all of that. And so people are coming out of the tavern and throwing like gang signs, all those modes of recognition to one another out in the out in the street. And so this had an effect on the local population. There were a lot of Masons out there back then. And so finally we get a letter September 1st, 1826, like 10 days before Morgan disappears, urging the Masons of the area to restrain their passions. And this past master by the name of Henry Brown publishes a very lengthy piece admonishing everybody to just cool their jets, that Masonry will survive, but we shouldn't do what we're about to do, or what he felt was about to happen. But things progressed anyway. They tried to burn down the printer. There was an arson attempt, although after the arson attempt, the master of the lodge in Batavia put up a reward with $100 rewards, attesting that he had not done it, nor had any of the members of his lodge apparently had done it. But he offered a $100 reward for information leading to the arrest of the arsonists. And that arson is even suspect because there were suspiciously barrels of water placed around the printer shop so that the arson could be quickly dealt with. I don't know if the publisher, Mr. Miller, was psychic, but he seemed to know kind of what was going on. So,
and just to one of your points earlier, there had been, I'm sure I will mess up the dates, but the Grand Lodge of England forms in 1717, and then I want to say it was like 1723 maybe was the first publication of an expose of Masonic ritual. Like there have been exposés of Masonic ritual since the very beginning. And as you said, well, as you said, someone else said, the fraternity would have survived. It's not like this would have single-handedly destroyed the fraternity. Most likely, we can't know, but
yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, when this does end up being published after his disappearance, we find that Morgan really took an existing expose and penned some editor's notes in the margins, is all that he really did. He did not add very much for strength or ornament to the expose. It was just mild notes in it. Our own library and museum here in Washington State has got a copy of one of the very first editions of Morgan's expose down in the library, published in Rochester. And boy, it's just sitting on the shelf and you can go and take a look at it. It's pretty cool to be able to have it, right? So as a
that was another thing that struck me about this whole thing was, that all the shenanigans that went on didn't stop the publication of the book after all. Like, it's not like, yeah.
No, didn't stop the publication of the book. They made a bit of money off of it. It was interesting.
Jeremy, I just wanted to sort of withdraw from the actual Morgan situation himself for a sec and just talk about briefly, like, so late 1820s, upstate New York. This is still the American frontier at that time, isn't it? Like it's
absolutely right.
Yeah. So what was Freemasonry like in New York? I mean, the reason I ask that is it's got to be almost inconceivable to us, because any of us here have grown up with electricity, the telephone, fast communications, the cars, whatever. You must have gone for years in some of the remote lodges in New York without seeing a Grand Lodge officer, or I just wonder how things looked at, how it was like, how it worked like that.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of concentration because you've got infrastructure now being built in upstate New York right around this time. The Erie Canal was going in up, and that was sort of the path at which Morgan and the wagon took after he was abducted from Canandaigua, was up around that Erie Canal area. But yeah, you had an incredible explosion of growth in masonry throughout New York, with they said 1,000 Masons a year on average being raised from like 1790 up through the Morgan affair. It was growing tremendously throughout upstate New York at that time. And so you would have a real disconnect because, again, it's the woods and it's hilly country. It's very heavily forested. And it would take you days to get from downstate New York up to someplace like Rochester or Batavia or Genesee County itself. So, yeah.
But even just to what you say there of 1,000 a year for all those years, I mean, that speaks volumes right there about guarding the West Gate. That's too much too often, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
Because I had read somewhere, and I mean, I'm getting just a little bit ahead of it, but in the wake of the Morgan affair, the number of lodges in New York State was reduced by, from somewhere in the 400s down to, a fifth or a sixth of that number, which again, obviously the fraternity had exploded in growth, and that would indicate to me that there was some already existing some problems within it. If I'm right in that assessment.
I think I think yes, and there were a lot of Masons that under the pressures that came to bear after because if you think about it, you're talking about the Masonic fraternity being blamed for an extrajudicial rendition of not just one person, but a couple of people, to face whatever shadowy justice the Masons were going to meet to these folks. There were serious repercussions through both the religious community and through the secular community, where being a Mason could get you and did get you kicked out of your congregation. It was advertised in the local gazettes that if you had a business and you posted that you were an anti-Mason, then that was a badge of honor and could get you extra people into your shop. It was that sort of you did not want to be associated with the fraternity back then, because people are very opportunistic.
And I think we're sort of drawing to an end of our time for the first episode here.
Oh.
And so, I'm assuming, very worshipful sir, that you're able to hang on and record for a little longer with us.
Yep.
But I think we will, if it's all right with everybody, push the discussion of the repercussions and the anti-Masonic period into our next episode. And since there's a lot there too. So with that, please do check out the link to Jeremy's presentation on YouTube. Feel free to comment to us or to email us and etc. If you have thoughts on the topic, and we'll be happy to respond. And with that, on behalf of David and me and Craig and the absent Stephen, Jeremy, first of all, thank you for being on the show. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon on the Working Tools podcast. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.